Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look then at what is on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour or so, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the deputy editor of Spiked Online, Tom Slater. Welcome to both of you. As ever, front pages, though, to kick off, and the Metro leads with accusations of cronyism against the government after the National Audit Office found that £18 billion of taxpayers' money had been used to award contracts to private companies in relation to the pandemic. The Guardian hears that almost 500 suppliers with links to politicians were designated high priority to pitch for the contracts. The Telegraph reporting on what it calls a mutiny within the Labour Party after its former leader Jeremy Corbyn was readmitted today, having been suspended for insisting there wasn't an institutional problem with anti-Semitism during his tenure. The Financial Times understands that Boris Johnson will announce a £12 billion funding package tomorrow aimed at promoting the use of green energy sources. Families could be allowed 5 days to enjoy socialising with one another over the Christmas period, according to The Sun. While The Star has word that Dawn French's sitcom, The Vicar of Dibley, is to be revived at Christmas with a series of specials filmed on Zoom or over Zoom. Goodness me. So, Sonia Sodha, Tom Slater are here. Going to kick off with the Daily Telegraph, the news of Jeremy Corbyn being readmitted, and depending which side of the Labour Party you're on, this is either good or bad news, Sonia.
Yeah, so I think Jeremy Corbyn's supporters will be quite pleased, but I'm not so sure that Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, will be that pleased. And he sort of issued a series of tweets this evening that made it clear that he thought that the statement that Jeremy Corbyn put out back when the EHRC report first came out 3 weeks ago was totally wrong. This is a real mess for Labour. I think there were people in the Jewish community who looked at that decision by Labour's General Secretary to suspend Corbyn immediately for those awful comments that he made the day that the report came out, basically saying that claims of anti-Semitism have been exaggerated by Labour's political opponents, which was actually something that the EHRC report identified as a big problem with anti-Semitism in Labour. So there were people in the Jewish community who looked at that decision to suspend him immediately and took some faith in that. Now, the problem for Keir Starmer is that as part of Labour's flawed disciplinary process, the AHRC called this process out in its report. That decision about what to do about Corbyn went to a committee of a subcommittee of Labour's national ruling body, the NEC, today. And they seem to have taken the decision to reinstate Jeremy Corbyn with only the mildest of raps on the knuckles, despite the fact that although he's clarified that statement that he's made, he has not apologised for it. He has not acknowledged that it was completely the wrong thing to say. He has not acknowledged for any of the findings that the EHRC made about how the Labour Party under his leadership acted unlawfully. So it's quite a disturbing day, I think, for Labour. I think it's going to be very difficult for Keir Starmer. It wasn't his decision to make this particular decision. It's a decision that's been made by a Labour subcommittee. It's clear that he's not that happy about it. But, I think most of all for Jewish people who felt hounded out of the Labour Party because of anti-Semitism, I think they will look at this decision by the party and they'll just think, we thought the party was had at least taken the first step towards rebuilding bridges. And, I think they'll be feeling pretty angry and disappointed and disgusted tonight. And indeed, that's what we've seen from the statements that movements like the Jewish Labour movement have made this evening.
Yes, picking up from that then, Tom, obviously a lot of consternation has been spoken. We've had some reaction already from the likes of Margaret Hodge, who's been very outspoken about this. But in the great scheme of things, does it still matter? Jeremy Corbyn is yesterday's man in terms of Labour, and Keir Starmer has signalled a different approach.
No, completely. I think, if anything, at least in the medium term, this is going to potentially kind of scupper Keir Starmer's attempt to try and make a clean start, particularly on the issue of anti-Semitism in many people's minds. I don't think he really had much choice. I think if the NEC rather had actually taken the move to suspend Corbyn, it would have plunged the party more or less deeper into civil war. I also think it's important to point out that Corbyn, in many respects, is a bit of a symptom of a broader problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party on the left more broadly. The issue was that he had a remarkably high tolerance for anti-Semitism in the party, whilst not necessarily partaking in it explicitly himself. But I have to say that it is quite striking that so many people on the Labour left are acting as if Jeremy Corbyn is the victim in all of this. There's a quote in some of the papers from the Jewish Labour movement making clear that the victims of anti-Semitism are not Jeremy Corbyn. They are the party members, the MPs and many of the supporters who were hounded out of the party because of the increasing prevalence of these very ugly, very anti-Semitic views. And I think it's important that whilst it's quite clear that Jeremy Corbyn couldn't be suspended indefinitely, at the same time it shouldn't necessarily kind of avoid us from making the clear criticisms of his tenure, which saw tolerance for anti-Semitism be remarkably high, and something which I think has really destroyed the Labour Party's relationship with the Jewish community for a generation at least. So Keir Starmer's got his work cut out for him, but he always did in this respect.
Yes, he is the picture story on the front page of The Guardian too. Labour Party reinstates Corbyn after 19 days. But their lead story is the National Audit Office report about the purchasing of PPE. I'm going to move us on to that, if you don't mind, Sonia, because there's lots to pack in tonight, which makes grim reading for the government. I guess they always anticipated that this point would come.
They did, and this is such a damning report. It's hard to know where to start. It's from the public spending watchdog at the National Audit Office, and the findings are really quite extraordinary. So they report that billions and billions of pounds of COVID-related contracts that will be for stuff like PPE, but also processing of tests, for example, have gone to large companies without any competitive tendering at all. Now, of course, the government did have to get these things out the door quickly, but you would still expect there to be some competitive tendering. And unsurprisingly, as a result, there have been some really dodgy decisions made and a huge waste of taxpayers' money going on huge contracts where actually contractors haven't even fulfilled those contracts, and they've not produced, for example, or supplied PPE that meets clinical standards. And we're talking about contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds here. And there are a couple of findings it's particularly important to draw out. I think the first is, over £10 billion of contracts that were not competitively tendered. But also there are some huge contracts there that where individuals have profited hugely. So there's a case in the US at the moment where a jewelry company in Miami, of all the kind of bizarre companies to fund to do this, got a contract worth over 220 million to supply PPE to the NHS, and they paid a Spanish businessman over 20 million. I can't remember if it's dollars or pounds, a huge sum of money to help broker that. And it's kind of like the question is, where is this money going? And then the other really important finding is that companies that were recommended by a political contact for COVID tendering seem to have been 10 times more likely to get awarded a contract. And this looked so dodgy in the context of all these debates about cronyism in relation to COVID. We've got, the partners of two Conservative MPs chairing track and trace, chairing the vaccine task force. It's really, there's all these companies that have got links to the government, like through personal contacts, who seem to have been awarded contracts. So I think it raises huge questions about value for money for the taxpayer tonight.
Yes, I suppose it's not as bad as America, where states were literally outbidding each other to purchase ventilators, which was quite extraordinary. At least our centralised system allowed the government to bid, and we weren't racing against ourselves, despite racing against many other nations in defence. But the Metro come clean over this £18 billion COVID deals. 18 billion was the money spent by July the 31st. The report found that ministers set aside normal standards of transparency. Firms recommended by MPs, peers and ministers' offices were given priority. The whole system seems to have been set up, according to Meg Hillier, the chairwoman of the Commons Public Accounts Committee, with this sort of idea of the crony virus culture, which is, very worrying. And this was just simply to speed up the process, Tom.
Yes, precisely. And I think most people wouldn't necessarily feel like they had to be a purist about the way in which these contracts were put out if it felt like we were getting results. We all know that this was an unprecedented crisis. You can understand that certain corners being cut insofar as trying to make sure that we had PPE or we had ventilators when those were the things that we considered to need, or again in the questions of test and trace and vaccines. But we have seen a litany of failures in all of these different areas. And as the Metro Splash actually inside the paper details, also a lot of very questionable decisions from some of these czars who have been appointed, who are, married to Tory ministers in many cases. Kate Bingham, famously the vaccine czar, who was found in the past week to have spent £600,000 on communications executives. This isn't necessarily even just money that is being spent directly in relation to procuring the things that we need. So it's going to strike a lot of people as having a bit of a bad smell about it. There is a sense of cronyism and chamocracy. But I think, again, I think a lot of people would forgive this if it felt like the government was delivering on a lot of these things, whereas in many of these areas it certainly hasn't.
That is looking backwards. Let's look forward to Christmas, shall we? Which it seems all of us are in many respects. The Daily Telegraph, household mixing ban may save Christmas. This is the idea that after the lockdown in England, we'll go into a tier system which bans household mixing, presumably indoors. We wait to see that. And that takes us to The Sun, which suggests by Harry Cole that it will be 5 days of Christmas, starting... Oh, we don't have it. Oh, well, I'll tell you about it, shall I, anyway? 5 days of Christmas, starting on Christmas Eve, which is under consideration by ministers. Sonia, just quickly then.
So, I mean, this is partly about what comes in place on the 2nd of December when the 4-week English lockdown ends. And there's been a lot of talk about how tiers 1 and 2 weren't particularly effective in bringing down virus incidents. So we will be having tougher restrictions. And I think, politicians are looking forward to Christmas. They want to make sure that they've brought virus rates down as much as they can going into Christmas so that some household mixing can be permitted, because it would be really awful if over the Christmas break, households can't meet indoors. So I'm confident politicians will be doing everything that they can to make sure that in the run up to Christmas, we're probably going to be living under tighter restrictions than we were before we were, at least in areas of the country that were in tiers 1 and 2, before we moved into the 4-week national lockdown. And that will be to try and make sure that people can have some sort of Christmas or Boxing Day. I don't think it's going to be, have like 50 people over to your house or anything like that. But I suspect they will allow, a couple of households, maybe even 3 households to mix within those groups over the sort of festive break.
Yes, two or 3 households merging together, seeing nobody else over Christmas. Hopefully not too much impact then, Tom.
Well, that's the aim. I think a lot of the reason that they're having to make this kind of last-ditch attempt to save Christmas is, frankly, despite what the polls are saying, despite what a lot of people are saying, that they feel they would rather go without Christmas in order to bring these things down. If they even try to impose some kind of ban on household mixings over the festive period, you would just have loads of people just completely ignoring it. I think that's one thing that isn't really taken into account with a lot of these restrictions, is you do need public consent for these kinds of things. And whilst a lot of people are very concerned about coronavirus still, they want to do the best that they can. At the same time, we're all human. We all need to spend time with our families, and certain things, even in the midst of a pandemic, need to sometimes be put above that, I tend to think.
OK. Plenty more still to come, including, could a Brexit trade deal really be imminent? We will talk about that in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Sonia Sodha and Tom Slater. Tom, straight back to the Telegraph then. A Brexit trade deal could be just ... fill in the blanks. What's your reckoning?
So, yes, is there white smoke appearing from the chimneys of this negotiation? So the story on the front page of the Telegraph suggesting that there has been a bit of movement. There's potentially been a concession from the French in particular on the question of fishing and not maintaining the same access that they have at the moment to our fishing waters. You've got the Irish Taoiseach talking about there being a landing zone for a deal. But at the same time, again, interesting statements from the government. The Downing Street spokesman there making clear that whatever deal is made must fully respect UK sovereignty, in line with that old mantra of take back control. So again, it feels like weeks and weeks now that we've been in a position where a deal is to be done, but there's still space for both sides to move. But it does seem, at least on the basis of the Telegraph's reporting, that we could be seeing some sort of breakthrough in the next couple of days. And
meanwhile, the Financial Times, Sonia, saying that Boris Johnson is seeking this Downing Street reset with his green industrial revolution. Writing in the Financial Times, it says, what has he said?
So this is meant to be the PM's big reset week, but of course he's self-isolating. So he's trying to do it through sort of announcements from self-isolation instead. This is all about a green industrial revolution, so more jobs in the green sector, more investment, banning petrol and diesel cars by 2030. But it's kind of all stuff that the government has announced already anyway. And I think the real proof of the pudding is the government's really good at announcing stuff at the moment and sort of doing all these big, making a big song and dance about new agendas. But does it actually follow through and come up with the investment that would be needed to create lots of new jobs, just when people are losing jobs in the green industries, for example? And on that, I'm very sceptical, and I think the jury is very much still out. I think this is Boris Johnson desperately trying to sort of, rebrand himself after a very difficult week and some really stupid comments on devolution.
Yes, indeed, running to stay still financially or otherwise, and all of this via a Zoom Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow, which will be an interesting moment, won't it, in parliamentary history. Thank you both very much indeed. We will see you for more at 11:30. Tom Slater, Sonia Sodha, thank you.